All right, guys, we are back in my garage for another video, and today we are going to be talking about my conspiracy theory on why the B58 sucks. In particular, I think this car has a very unique failure mode that has not been seen on any other vehicle in my experience. So BMW has basically reinvented what can make a PCV system fail. I think that there are a lot of great things about it though. So in this video, we'll talk about both the good and the bad and try to rehash it for those of you that are new to the channel or maybe just need a refresher on what makes the B58 PCV suck. So hopefully you guys find this video useful. Now, as always, for everybody that's new to the channel, I create these videos to help keep you updated on the latest developments in our community, as well as discuss technical topics so that we have a better understanding of how our engines work. So if you're interested in more videos like that, be sure to subscribe because there will be a lot more coming out in the future. So again, I know we have a lot of new people here, so we're going to recap really quickly how a PCV works. If you don't need this refresher, feel free to skip forward. But a PCV system is critical for your engine's reliability simply because no matter how you drive your car, it's going to build up positive pressure in the crankcase. So on top of your pistons, it's compressing the air to create more power, but some of that air is going to leak past, especially because you're creating hundreds of PSI of combustion pressure, especially with a turbocharger. So some of that air is going to leak past the piston rings, down the cylinder walls, into the crankcase. So when you build up that positive pressure, it has to escape somewhere. And if you don't have a PCV system, it'll come out of your oil pan gasket or your rear main seal, cause oil leaks and other issues. So you want to create a path for that air to escape. Now, some of this air is mixed with oil vapor since there's a lot of stuff churning underneath the piston. So you probably want a way to try to filter it out. Most cars have some kind of integrated filtration system that allows some oil to drain back to your oil pan while trying to filter out just the gases. And then because of emissions requirements, they are recirculated into your intake path. So on a lot of cars, you'll see a hose going from the valve cover directly back to the intake manifold, and that is designed to suck the air out of your crankcase and back into the intake so that it can be burnt off in the combustion chamber. Now, the problem is, of course, with a turbocharged car, you're going to have issues because you're going to create positive boost pressure from the turbo, and that will create positive pressure in the intake manifold. So with a turbocharged car, you typically need a set of check valves that basically modify where the airflow is going. So if you're in no boost scenarios where you're just kind of cruising around town, yes, it will route air back to your intake manifold. But if you're creating boost and accelerating hard, then you can't do that. Otherwise, it'll push that positive pressure back into the crankcase where you're trying to relieve the pressure. So in those cases, you'll have a hose that goes back to the intake before the turbo so that you're going to run it into an area that only sees vacuum. Again, the downside, because some of the oil vapor is mixed in with your PCV gases, you're basically running that through your turbo and the entire intake path. But that is something that's just kind of necessary because of the nature of a turbocharger. Now, on top of that, BMW makes it even more challenging because they have eliminated the use of a throttle body and switched over to Valvetronic. So Valvetronic is BMW's method of controlling and limiting how much air goes into your engine depending on your throttle. And what it does is it extends how deep the valves open to let more air in for every stroke of the camshaft. So because of that, you aren't really using your throttle in a traditional method, which reduces how much vacuum is inside of your intake manifold. So instead of just running a hose from the valve cover to the intake manifold, you're not really going to see enough vacuum to pull out those PCV gases. So they use head ports, and head ports are little holes in the cylinder head that run air from the valve cover down into the cylinders, and they get sucked out using a Venturi effect. So the air that's getting sucked into the cylinder head passes by those head ports, which in turn creates a vacuum on the PCV system and sucks air out when you're in low load scenarios. So BMW again had to reinvent the wheel and create a much bigger challenge for themselves by adding Valvetronic and other engine systems that they use. It makes things very efficient, but it also has its drawbacks. So now let's talk about the different ways a PCV can suck. And the biggest one most people are concerned about is carbon buildup, with that oil vapor getting pushed through the PCV system, it's not going to get filtered out perfectly, even if there is an integrated air oil separator in your valve cover. So usually some of that oil vapor will make it back into your intake tract and it'll end up coating your valves. And since our cars are direct injection, we don't have port injectors to spray on top of it and keep them clean. Now, a couple things to remember. One, if you have port injection, it keeps the valves clean, but it doesn't reduce the oil vapor going through your engine. So if you have an engine that's pushing oil, it still can create other issues like diluting your octane that can create knock and hurt your performance. But on that side of things, if you're just focused on carbon buildup, yes, port injection can help address that. The other thing is that in this case, the biggest thing you can do to fix it is add a catch can. The catch can is what will actually filter out the oil and hopefully do a better job than any stock air oil separator that's built into your engine, so that you can basically separate the oil and have it in a catch can that you can empty out from time to time. Now, this also has its drawbacks, especially in winter when temperatures get really cold. A lot of times a catch can will collect a lot of water and that can freeze and cause other issues because obviously it expands and can cause your catch can or your hoses to crack. So it's not really something they typically recommend year round if you see freezing temperatures. But from a performance standpoint in the summer and when temperatures are hotter, it's definitely something that can give you a performance benefit by reducing how much oil is getting pushed back into your engine. Now, the great thing is with the B58, this isn't really an issue. I have two B58s that I've actually pulled the intake manifold and checked. Even with stock DI only setups, I've gone over 60,000 miles, checked my valves, and they were perfectly clean. And I haven't really seen any B58s have a lot of carbon buildup. You'll even hear people say, you know, it's a direct injection car with PCV issues, so I'm gonna slap a catch can on. And then they complain because the catch can doesn't catch anything. Well, that's the point. If you have a PCV system that's working well, it shouldn't be pushing a lot of oil. That means that your engine is healthy and running as clean as possible, so you're not getting a lot of those blow-by gases. And that has been my experience as well. I don't really see carbon buildup on either of my cars. Yes, they do have port injection now, but even when I pulled the intake manifold before adding port, there was no sign of excessive oil blow-by. So I think on the B58, generally speaking, they run very clean, and this is not why the B58 PCV sucks. Another issue the PCV system can have is broken check valves, which, like I said, with our turbocharged engines, the check valves are necessary to make sure that you're only pushing PCV gases to the right part of your intake path, depending on how you're driving. Now, really high boost levels can actually damage those check valves because they're only designed typically to run the stock amount of boost, which on a B58 is usually around 10 to 12 PSI. So if you're running 30 plus PSI, some people run into scenarios where they damage those check valves, and then when they get into boost, they get excessive oil consumption, they get oil getting blown through their valve cover into their intake path, and it's basically coating their intake manifold. Now again, a lot of oil will cause a lot of issues by diluting your octane and can cause knock and things like that. But of course, just in general, you don't want to run low on oil. You don't want oil getting pushed through your engine, and you definitely don't want boost pressure getting pushed back into your crankcase. This is a huge reliability risk that you don't want to experience. So if that's something that you are running into, the good news is, especially on Gen 2 B58s, they have upgraded check valves. They actually install inside of the valve cover, and where your head ports go, it will basically add a check valve. So when you're in boost, it will seal it up. But when you're out of boost, it will still allow the PCV system to vent and create a vacuum just like stock. So I think generally speaking, this is the best upgrade for a Gen 2 B58. But unfortunately, it's not an option for Gen 1 because the valve cover ports on our cars are not round. It actually has that slight chamfered edge, and a check valve typically uses a ball or a cylinder that can, effectively seal that opening when it needs to close. So because of the shape of our ports, there isn't really an option yet. Stay tuned, maybe a solution will come in the future, but otherwise for a Gen 1 car, the other option is to just block the head ports off. I did that on my 340i, and that helped just eliminate the chance of any boost pressure making it back to the valve cover and damaging a check valve. Now, this is definitely an issue if you're pushing really high boost levels, but for most people, they don't run into this issue. So I would say this isn't a reason why the B58 PCV sucks. Yes, it does have a limit, but the limit is pretty high and most people don't experience that unless they're pushing a big turbo setup. So I don't consider that a reason why the PCV sucks. Now, the real issue is that diaphragm, and the Gen 1 guys know exactly what I'm talking about. Right on top of the valve cover, there's that big circle, and if you pop the cap off, you will find a rubber diaphragm, and this diaphragm tends to fail. Now, I think the actual functionality of this diaphragm is extremely complex because yes, it almost functions kind of like a check valve, but there are still actual check valves integrated into the valve cover that can break. And if they break, doing anything with this diaphragm doesn't actually help. So this is a completely separate item on the valve cover. And my current understanding is that it's basically designed to control or modulate how much vacuum is being put on the crankcase. And there are a couple different checks in the intake path that help control this. One is there is actually a fresh air vent on the side of the crankcase, again, to make sure too much vacuum doesn't get pulled on it and kind of manage how much vacuum is being put on the crankcase. But the diaphragm on top of the valve cover seems to operate in a similar fashion. So it has a spring that tries to push it up, but it also has airflow coming in from the valve cover that can work its way through that hole in the middle down to the head ports. And then there's another check valve underneath. So it's kind of going up and down to modulate how much air is actually going through the valve cover. Now, there are a couple things to consider here. One is this diaphragm is not completely unique to the Gen 1 B58. Doing a little more research, you can find it's even something on like N55 cars. I saw this video from Vehicular DIY where he replaced it on his N55 engine. It was not as easy to replace on a Gen 1 B58 because that cap wasn't really designed to be serviceable, but you can see that it is something that has been in BMW engines for a while. And if you hear the video where he shares that it's making like a squealing sound, it's very similar to the same squealing sound B58 cars make when that diaphragm is damaged. It kind of whistles as air is fighting through that little puncture in the diaphragm. Now, the other thing about this is that the diaphragm itself just fails. It is a weak point. Generally, what we see is mostly it fails from idling the car too long. And I don't want to hear anybody trying to make excuses for BMW that this is okay. I don't care if you idle your car for 15 minutes or an hour. Your car should be able to idle without smoking like a chimney and acting like the engine blew up. There is no excuse for this failure whatsoever. But this is typically the scenario that happens where a car is idling for a while, that diaphragm is vibrating up and down, and eventually it can basically damage itself. It can crack or split. And that creates the smoke that you see through the exhaust and the whistling sound, and it isn't fixed until you replace that diaphragm. So I would say it's not something that fails over time. It's not something that needs to be replaced every 20,000 miles, 50,000 miles, whatever. It is just something that is weak. And when it is in a scenario that overwhelms it, it breaks. If you never idle your car for that long and drive it, pretty moderately, it could probably last for hundreds of thousands of miles. But I think that the B58 PCV sucks because of auto start stop. And you guys know that I'm one of the guys that's not really that against auto start stop. I still use it on my X7. I used it on my 440i for several years. And it isn't something that I think causes an issue if you design the system to handle it. And I think BMW missed it here. I think that by using auto start stop with their testing, they did not adequately test how the cars idle. And probably something that I wouldn't think about even as an engineer. I would assume that that is an extremely low load, easy scenario on the engine. I would focus more on higher stress scenarios. But this is something where with the vibrations that are going through that diaphragm, if you idle it for a long time and everything that they put into place, they're pretty much acknowledging that there could be a concern if too much vacuum or issues happen at idle. But by trying to control that, I think they just assumed that it would work, and it clearly doesn't. This is something that's plaguing B58s to the point that now we have an extended warranty. There's a separate repair kit just for the PCV systems now that's sold by BMW. So they are acknowledging that this is a problem. So in my opinion, from my complete outside point of view, not being a BMW engineer, I think that auto start stop is what created this issue. Now, there are, of course, a bunch of different ways to fix it. Like I said, you can do the check valves and block off your head ports and things like that. But the PCV delete in some form or fashion is the solution. Getting rid of the diaphragm is the only way to avoid the failure because there's nothing there to fail anymore. And I put a PCV delete on both my 440i and my 340i, but I think I have a unique setup on my 340i I want to walk you guys through. That probably is the best way to replicate the OEM setup and just make it a little bit stronger. So this is my 340i, and you can see that I have added my catch can back on. And the reason why I do this is because, one, when I go to my track days, they don't want you to just have dump tubes that basically insinuate you're just dumping oil on the ground, and of course that can be a safety risk. So I have to have a catch can when I take my car on track. But the other thing is because I feel like this more closely represents the stock configuration. You have venting out of the low side as well as out of the high side that goes into a catch can. But the only thing that's missing is with everything venting to atmosphere, you need a way to recirculate your oil. Because in the valve cover where it has the air oil separator, it tries to drain that oil back into the oil pan to make everything, completely service free. So that's what I added down here. I actually replaced my drain plug with an AN fitting, and then I have an AN hose that runs all the way down to the oil pan. Now, disclaimer here, this is not recommended by Ross Racing Performance. This is just something that Kevin did in his own engineering curiosity to try to make this system completely service free, because I don't want to drain oil. I don't want this to fill up with water in the winter. I want something that basically performs more similar to how the OEM system functions. So that drain goes all the way down to the oil pan, and I have a banjo fitting replacing the oil drain bolt. So this basically runs oil back to the oil pan. If there's any water in there, it'll burn off just like it would with OEM, but the old oil also gets pushed back into the oil pan. Now, the biggest concern I think people have with this is you don't want oil that came out of your PCV to go back into your oil pan, especially if you've ever drained your catch can. You've seen that it's really like murky and nasty looking. But that's the same stuff that's in your oil pan, especially if you do a lot of short drives. You might have taken off your oil cap and you look at it and you see it's got all that kind of white frothy residue on it. That's because you're not driving your car long enough to burn off all the moisture, so it's mixing with your oil and leaving some residue on different parts of your engine. The fix for that is changing your oil more often, because that's going to happen if you don't drive your car for long enough to get it up to temperature. But if you have a catch can that's separate from your engine, that's running at over 200 degrees Fahrenheit, now you have a cooler area for the water to collect and store, and it makes it look a lot more dramatic than it is. If all of that goes back to your oil pan, it'll evaporate off, it'll burn off, it'll run just like the stock setup that already is draining some oil back to your oil pan out of your valve cover. It's just giving you a much better filter to make sure you're separating the air and the oil before it vents. Now, I do have mine venting off to atmosphere. It would be something curious to see if maybe I routed it back to my intake manifold. I actually did try that for a while, but I couldn't find a way to get adequate vacuum on it. It would need that same Venturi effect. So I'd need probably like an adapter coming in at an angle or something so that the airflow coming by would pull the air and pull a vacuum on the catch can. So that, I think, would be like the ultimate upgrade. A recirculating catch can with a good filtration system and a recirculating line for the oil. So this is just what I've got. I kind of just wanted to show it to you guys. Maybe I'll make a separate video talking about this more, but that's what makes the B58 PCV suck. And this is a way to get around it while still maintaining how the PCV system works in general. So hopefully this helps you guys out, answers a couple questions, shares some things that I've been testing in the background. Let me know your thoughts. If you've got any other ideas or questions, I'd be curious to hear if you guys are trying other things to address the B58 PCV issues. But otherwise, I think that's it for this video. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope this helps. And if you have any other questions or comments, leave them down below. All right, guys, we are